Hello. Let's change the angle on this a little bit. Getting a heck of a glare off of the window right behind me. This. So, as you are watching this, you must have received my message. We are not having class on Monday. That's because my daughter is having a surgery on Monday. I'm getting a couple things done. Nothing all too serious, but whenever you're dealing with a newborn, that's always something that you want to be there for. With that, I figure what we'll do is instead of having class or having someone come in, we'll finish off the lesson that we were having on our last meeting time where we're talking about use of force. There were a couple of points I wanted to discuss with you, and then a couple of videos I wanted you to watch. I was looking for the one I'd watched related to a recent Oklahoma. It was an Oklahoma video that came out from a encounter that took place at the end of last year. I couldn't find it. I had it in my watch list for an account I had from my previous university, but they apparently they stopped. It's no longer active, so, and they did that over spring break. So it's too bad. And I couldn't find it whenever I did a search because the YouTube search parameters, when you start altering those are notoriously bad for hiding basically what you're looking for. It'll just bring up what it thinks it wants you to watch rather than what you are actually trying to find. If you guys ever want a demonstration that I can literally show you in class of just how bad it is, because I can know exactly what I'm looking for. I can put in details of time, date, location, that kind of thing, and it still won't pull up exactly what I'm looking for until I specifically put the exact title in, or if I dig in through the search engine, the search results a few pages, because they put what they want you to see first, and Google does it as a search engine. YouTube does it. Most do that to a pretty serious degree. And if you want a conversation about that in class ever, bring it up and I'll go into detail and I'll tell you just how bad it is. And has more of an impact on things than what you would think. So much so that it has affected our society quite drastically, in my opinion. But we were talking about things going on in the world. Probably the thing I'd want you to kind of key into are the banks that are collapsing. In the past couple of weeks, there have been 5 that have had serious issues. The biggest one would be the Silicon Valley Investing Bank, or SVB. Reason being that you want to look at that one is because that's where a lot of money is involved in that. You're talking billions upon billions. Basically, what happened is they have no money. There was a run on the banks, like what they had in the 1920s when we started off the Depression. So you should be watching that very, very closely. As of right now, the last thing I heard was that our government was basically guaranteeing all investments into that bank without an upper limit, which means very bad things. Probably not as bad as depression, but as in slowing the fall into it is what I would expect. Okay, so we were talking about appropriate use of force. Specifically, we're talking about how hindsight's 2020, and you're not dealing with constraint that an officer faces whenever they're in the situation. So anytime that you have an excessive use of force case that goes to the courts, whether it's deadly force or whether it's just non-deadly excessive force, they typically use the same. That's kind of showing, that's nasty looking. They use the same kind of determination. So, and that's that objective reasonableness standard. The book will give you the definition of it. It's the one we've been using since the late 80s. That's Graham versus Connor. And so I'll tell you a little about the characteristics of that case and a little about the history and how it switched to that. And then we'll go with where there are questions and what that leads us into today. So the case itself, what it was, and I bet the book probably gives you some details on it. Police officer noticed a vehicle that pulled into a convenience store. There's 2 people in the vehicle. One gets out, quickly runs into the store, runs back to the vehicle, and they take off fast. Now, what an officer sees there is in terms of suspicious, well, that's highly suspicious. That fits basically what you see anytime you see a convenience store robbery. Someone goes in real quick, gun in face, give me the money, and then they're out. But if you're outside the store, you're probably not going to see all that. You're just going to see someone run in, run out, and go. What had happened is the passenger was a diabetic, and he was having a blood sugar issues. Blood sugar was dropping precipitously, and so the driver, ran into the convenience store. I think it was the driver, may have been the passenger at that point. I can't remember. One of them runs in, sees that there's a long line, and then hotfoots it right back out the car because they can't wait that long. If they wait that long, it's like you're talking about passing out and having serious issues. If any of you know anybody who's diabetic or has ever looked into how exactly how bad that can be, of course, it's life threatening, and how people act whenever they're having that type of diabetic issues, they act a lot like an intoxicated person. So as they're fleeing that convenience store, going to the next one, police officer pulls them over, and things kind of go how you would expect. He goes up to the driver, asks what's going on. The driver tells him, the passenger here is having a diabetic issue. The line was too long, and that's why we went in, saw the line, got out, and went to the next one because we can't wait that long. And that's a story that most people will take fairly well at face value. I mean, verify, but take it on face value. Which that's what the officer did. Is he called in someone to go check out the gas station to see if that's in fact what happened, if there was a robbery that occurred or not, because they hadn't received a call or anything, so they needed to investigate it. In the meantime, while this is taking place, the passenger is in throes of a diabetic issue, and he starts acting like someone who's intoxicated. Starts disregarding any commands from the officer, gets out of the vehicle, starts running around, and there's an altercation that takes place. Essentially, what ends up happening is the officer arrests the individual, throws him into the hood of the vehicle hard enough to, injuries that he acquired were along the lines of a bruising, ruptured eardrum. That was from yelling. And I want to say that he either had broken wrist or a broken bone in his foot. I can't remember which. It was one of the two. He had bruising from the handcuffs, I think, and broken foot while he was being put into the back of the police car and resisting. This at that point, intoxicated, not really taking in the full gravity of what's going on, is resisting arrest, fighting back, and so it does not go well. There's a lot of force used. Meantime, you've got the driver who's the whole time pleading. He's like, "This is what's going on. It's a diabetic issue." The officer, while this was taking place, said, "I don't believe you," and thought that he was just intoxicated, so he was treating him fairly roughly. And all those injuries take place, and eventually, what happens is he gets word back that that there was no robbery or anything. The story is true, and forget that who eventually brings some candy or something like that for the person who's having a diabetic issue, so he gets that taken care of. But he's got all those injuries on top, so a lawsuit gets filed. So this is a civil court case related to excessive use of force. Now, historically, what they would do is they wouldn't look at objective reasonableness. What they would look at is they would look at the amount of force needed, the amount of force that was applied, whether injury had occurred, and then the officer's intent when using the force throughout the entire circumstances. This case is the one that switched to objective reasonableness. And the reason why it's called objective reasonableness is we talked about it in terms of what the average officer would find acceptable given the circumstances that they're presented. Someone who's resisting arrest, the average officer, would they or would they not find it acceptable to use the amount of force to put the person in cuffs who's resisting arrest, put them in the back of the vehicle, even though there were injuries that were acquired in the process of it. Essentially what happens there is officer's intent drops out, because if you're still considering those four factors, you would have found the jury would have had to have found the officer guilty, because you're disregarding what's being told to you, and given the circumstances, is that situation, is that force needed? Not necessarily, no. So because of that case, officer's intent drops out, which inevitably leads to questions about acceptable levels of force and whether it's now acceptable to apply a greater level of force, or even we'll say to apply an acceptable level of force with malicious intent, which it does open up that opportunity. More so, you could also go and say, ask the question as to whether or not that opens up the we've talked about how the system has errors. It will always have errors because of the size, the number of instances, and how much they vary, and to what degree or what direction you want those errors to take place. And this one clearly leans more towards allowing the officers to apply force rather than inhibiting officers ability to use force. And which of those is the greater travesty, the greater issue, is something that our society is wrestling with, has historically wrestled with, and continues to. If you've been paying attention much in the way of policing issues in the last 7 years, I think since about 20, actually it's about 9 years, since about 2014, it's been a recurrent and repeatedly, mainstream question about the use of police use of force, police reform, and particularly in like the last 4 years, you have that push towards defunding the police, and a lot of that stems from, well, use of force, the fact that they're authorized to use force in certain scenarios. So there's been much in the way of social outcry related to it. You could say that a lot of it really picked up a lot of steam with varying points in our history. You could say, this issue goes all the way back to the 60s, the 90s, but the more recent one I'd say probably really picks up about 2014 when you had Michael Brown. Of course, you run into a lot of issues with Michael Brown. If you guys aren't familiar with the Michael Brown case, that's the one where the mainstream chant of "hands up, don't shoot" began. That the initial reports of that case were Michael Brown was a kid who had his hands up, was saying "don't shoot" when the officer shot him, 9 times or however many times he shot him, a number of times. Most people who tend to align themselves with that phrase don't know the actual case of what happened. It's actually one of the most, I wouldn't say well documented cases, has the largest amount of publicly available documentation. If you were to look up Michael Brown's case, the case against the officer, I used to remember the officer's name. I can't remember it for the life of me right now. But if you look up that case, you can literally pull up, the transcripts from trial, all the evidence that was admitted, witness statements, doctors' reports, medical examiners' reports, all that stuff. I mean, hundreds of thousands of pages of information is available for that. If you are interested in digging into it, basically what ended up happening with that is all of your firsthand eyewitnesses accounts at the time that were highly publicized in the media were lies. There were people who did not have any, weren't there, weren't watching, and were just repeating what they heard or what they thought had happened, even though they had no firsthand experience. All of the statements that said, they had his hands up, basically were recanted. And that's kind of the case with any news reports on most any police matters or anything like that. Is most police agencies will not make public statements while the investigation is ongoing. So the media is limited in terms of its available information to those who are willing to speak to them, at which point you're not dealing with the most reliable of witnesses, most reliable of sources. That's not to say that you aren't dealing with any. That's just to say that is a serious question as to whether or not you're getting valid and accurate information. Police won't talk about it because it could compromise the investigation. And in the case of Michael Brown, what happened was it was really, really poorly handled by the police. What they did, instead of answering the statements, because the first question that came up were how many times was he shot? They didn't answer that. The first thing they did was they released video of Michael Brown robbing a convenience store immediately beforehand. You can literally see he's a guy he was 18 at the time, so he is an adult. They'd call him a kid, a gentle giant, I think is what they'd commonly call him. 18 years old, 6 foot, is it 6'4" or taller? Over 300 pounds. So he's a big person, big. The owner of the convenience store that he robbed stole cigarettes from and something like that. It wasn't like an armed robbery or anything like that. It was just a strong arm type thing. He literally picks the guy up at one point. I mean, that's how big he is, and he doesn't struggle with it at all. Big guy. In terms of whether or not, deadly force is acceptable, someone who's unarmed. Typically what you'd want to look at is the amount of violence the person put forth and their capabilities. When you're talking about someone who's that capable, if you're dealing with anyone who's average size, yeah, that person is a deadly threat. that disparity in force is a very real thing people need to take into account. Of course, releasing that video in that context was a poor choice and led to a different public outcry. Like they weren't going to deal with the case itself, but to slander the character, which is a common thing that happens in the courtroom and in the public, the social media, the public side of things. What happened in the incident is the officer saw Brown and the other person was with him. I can't remember what started the encounter. I think they were walking in the middle of the street or something like that, and he pulled up and said, something to the account effect of trying to get them away from the walking in the middle of the road. And basically, I think that's how it started. I might be wrong in that, but what happened afterwards, I think Michael Brown approached the vehicle, the officer's vehicle. The officer wouldn't step out of the vehicle. He wouldn't let him step out of it, closed the door on him. So the guy stuck in the vehicle, and he punched the officer in the face and then tried to go for the officer's firearm when the officer tried to pull it inside the vehicle. I want to say the gun discharged while he was inside the vehicle. Michael Brown took off running. At the point the officer, I think, started chasing him, Michael Brown turned around and charged the officer. And it was at that point that the officer shot multiple times. And ultimately what happened is Michael Brown put his head down and was charging at the officer when a bullet came through the top of his head. And that's finally what stopped him. He was shot many times. Main thing to keep in mind is if you don't have a central nervous system hit or one directly to the heart, you're not going to have an automatic stop most of the time, especially if you got someone who's big or enraged or if they're on drugs, that kind of things. Like they tend to shrug those things off, even though they're deadly and that person is going to die. It can take anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes or more for someone to actually die from this type of wounds, bleed out or suffocate. If you hit one of the lungs, that kind of thing. And those things they can take minutes. So you're still in the fight until that person finally stops and your life is still at risk. But that's a little bit about that case. I'm kind of on a little bit more than I expected about that. There have been many other cases where there have been huge outcries about it. Another one the one that probably bothered me the most was the one with Jacob Blake. You've probably heard that name before. He was the one that the NFL literally wore his name on their helmets, if I remember correctly. And basically, the video showed that he was reaching in his vehicle for a knife when one of the officers there shot him and killed. Or yeah, I don't remember if they killed him or paralyzed, but they shot him. Basically, you have to realize is they were called out for a domestic where he was trying to take the vehicle to his girlfriend or former partner, and apparently she'd gone on record saying that beforehand she was sexually assaulted by him immediately beforehand. So it's like, think of the trauma that she went through to see that your attacker, your attacker is literally being publicized as so much so that their name is being put into the NFL kind of thing. It's like the divergence between morality, informed people, and morality. And there's a big divergence there. You get those who are taking moral stances on other sides. We had those who were informed of what had really occurred and those who weren't, and those who understand the nature of getting in one's vehicle and even a knife in a gunfight. If you're talking less than a few yards, a knife you're probably going to die. Even if you shoot that person, it's like you have a good chance of dying there. That's a little bit about social outcry, and that's going to continue. And there are verified cases where it's the other way, where the officer just uses deadly force and there's no call for it whatsoever. There was cases like concealed carrier gets pulled over. He's a passenger with his kids in the back. His girlfriend or wife was driving, and they get pulled over. He notifies the officer he's a concealed carrier. Officer asks for his license and probably his gun, the CHCL, his concealed carry license. He goes to get it. Officer freaks out because he's moving around and shoots him and kills him. And it's like, yeah, that's completely uncalled for. And you have other instances where a person shot in the back. Those things happen and need to be dealt with as well. So there's good reason for the outcry, and there's also the ones that are false. Just be aware that anytime you see it in the media, don't make an immediate judgment. Wait till you find out as much as you can, and wait until police start releasing their reports, so you can see whether or not there is justification or whether or not there's been any other issues. For example, the think it was Georgia. Person was shot in the back 9 times by a police officer. There's video of it. And you can see in the video, the police are actually laying a weapon next to the guy after he's on the ground dead and falsifying their reports. It's like, yeah, you got a whole bunch of stuff that's wrong there. So, but the question is, when you're looking at too much force or too little, which is the greater issue? It's a really, really hard question. But to kind of get a little bit at that and try to understand it from an officer's perspective and then the perspective of the system, the court system, how it all works, I have a couple videos I'm going to show you. In it, you'll see exactly what happens when too little force is used. In both of these videos, you'll see exactly that. The officers involved in both of these videos, the officers die. The first video I'm going to show you for years was used as training. You're going to see where there are errors made. I may actually interrupt the video and show you and kind of point those out. In the second video, I'm probably just going to let it play. I'll probably preface it before I bring it up, and you'll get a better, clear idea for the time dimension. How much time do you have to react? How much time do you have to make that appropriate decision? And how quickly things can go from dealing with what seems like a routine situation to you're not going to make it out of that situation. It's pretty serious. So I'll start those now. I'm hoping my internet flow isn't so much, so little that it starts to lag or anything. If it does in this video, let me know. And what I'll do is I'll post out links to each video so you guys can watch those outside of this video, watch them on YouTube and see those pretty clearly yourself. All right, so screen share. Screen. Okay, that's the second video. So say here. So this one. This one has your standard inappropriate. Let me come up with the second one. Yes, because these are traumatic. This one's a longer one. I probably will let most of it, if not all of it, play through. At the end, you're going to hear the screams of the officer. It is difficult to listen to. It is upsetting. So I don't do trigger warnings, but that's about as best as you're going to get. This is upsetting. This is hard to watch. Even in times where I've shown this video in class, typically because of how the situation transpires, some students will laugh at the beginning of it because it seems so ridiculous, because it does. One of the subjects is the person who gets pulled over is a Vietnam veteran, is mentally unhinged. So he acts like you would expect a crazy person to do. Is there anything else I need to tell you about that? Yeah, this is a hard one to watch, but even despite that, it is good for you to have an idea of the kinds of things officers, the risks that they run in the line of duty. Now there's a third one. Make that a little bit larger. So a person gets pulled over. I'm going to pause it right there for a second. So, two things I do want to add. One, this is a big issue. This all officers advise never let the person return to the vehicle once they're out of the vehicle, and this is one of the cases as to why. Second, there's been some chatter. I haven't verified to see if it's accurate or not, but the officer that was involved in this, there's been some talk that he may have been written up for excessive use of force in his encounters before, which identify his hesitancy for getting more directly involved in it. He's kind of staying back. All right. So, like I said, that's hard to watch. If you watch the thing in the entirety, you can actually hear the officer's last breaths. Um, I guess the only real positive note you can get out of this is the suspect was later apprehended, I believe, out in the woods. He had been shot. Yeah, I think he was shot in the stomach, but he was going. He pulled through. Got the death penalty, and a few years ago, he was actually put to death. So that's about as positive as you can get out of that. Never let someone return to the vehicle. And if you don't use enough force, that's the kind of situation you're walking into. How do you approach the person as they got in the vehicle? Put his hands on them to kind of forcibly under control. It's like you have all those as options. If you'd been closer when you first got the rifle rather than backing up, you could have shot him any number of times, spine, back of the head, anything like that. And it's like he'd been perfectly well within his range to do that because he's literally getting a rifle to come and try to kill you. You as an officer, you probably want to wait till they have it in hands and turn around, but that's also more and more danger you're inserting into the situation. It also reminds me of it's a I think it's a Chinese saying, maybe it was in Japanese. To be kind to your enemy is to be cruel to yourself. When it comes to use of force, that's exactly the case. The kinder you are to the people you're dealing with can be a cruelty to you because it puts you at greater risk. The likelihood that you're going to be hurt, injured, die, they all massively increase with the lower levels of force that you apply. Sort of like grappling versus striking. I don't know if I mentioned this in class. It's like throwing a punch is a whole lot easier than it is to try to put someone into a hold, a choke hold, or to pin their arms down, that kind of thing. It's like it takes a whole lot more effort to do that, and it puts you at significant risk. It's a whole lot easier to pull out a stick and smack someone over the back of the head than it is to throw a punch, because you don't know how effective you're going to be whenever you hit that punch, how well it's going to connect, or the resistance to it. You have a lot more force, you have a lot more reach, a lot more range, and so the kinder you are to your enemies, the crueler you are to yourself is a statement that very well fits to any force on force application. It's like the better control you have, the least amount of risk you want to present to yourself, the more force you're going to use. Okay, so that's that first video. A lot of errors made in that, and those are readily apparent. Mainly, the biggest one is the removing oneself from the situation. The second one is, of course, letting him go back to the vehicle as soon as he got out of the vehicle and was acting that way. I probably should have put him in cuffs at that point, just hands on, take him to the ground, put him in cuffs. For whatever reason you have someone who's acting in that way, that's probably what would an easier way to get to it. But it's easy also to be armchair quarterbacking kind of thing. Being there in that situation, the stress involved, the adrenaline and all of those things quickly and very quickly cloud one's cognitive abilities and their physical abilities. If you've ever been in a high stress situation, your hands start shaking like this. All fine motor movement goes away entirely. And that's why if you look at police shootings in general, it's like 80% of shots miss their target. Why? Adrenaline kicks in, and the fine motor control that you need to accurately hit your target tends to go away. And very, very quickly, you go from being able to hit a target like that to you can't hit someone who's human sized very easily at all. The second one is a domestic case. Basically, what it was is there was a domestic incident between the person you're going to see in this video and his girlfriend at the time. They're living together. She called police out afterwards. They spoke with her, but he had already fled. And later in this officer's shift, he found out where the person was at a friend's house, goes to the friend's house to basically to interview the guy to find out what had happened and that kind of thing. And you'll see how it goes from there. This one, it's going to be a lot harder to see where any mistakes are made. So I will share that now. All right, sharing screen. Here we go. So this one's 4 minutes in length. You can find longer videos where it shows me even, drive up to the house and all that, but I think this one picks up because I've had to find a few different videos because some of them disappear from the internet kind of thing. I think this one's got most of it in here. I'll pause that and talk about that real quick. The reason why it's blurred out is because this is a third party's home, so privacy concerns, third party right here. When the suspect, the person involved in the domestic incident comes out, he'll step out of the house and will no longer be blurred. So you saw how quick that was. It's cold, so it's not unreasonable the person to have their hands in their pockets, but his hand never came out. Yeah, it's literally like three frames between everything's fine to gun out, gun immediately turned, and that's when it started firing into his face. He got shot, I think it was 7 times in the face, something of that nature. It's a 22, and then the suspect turned the gun on himself. When you think about, what could he have done in that situation? Not a whole lot. It's like maybe he could have grabbed the guy from the shirt, the coat, the side of it, spun him as hard as he could. It's like maybe, but not a whole lot with that kind of distance there. Not much you can do, and that's just how quickly something can turn from routine to deadly. And when you start making, you start looking at any of these cases, if you were ever to be a juror, or if you were ever to be an officer, or go to court and have to argue one of these types of cases, it's like that's the nature of these incidences. So you have to understand just how fast things go, and just how quickly they go from monotonous to the worst of situations. Not an easy thing to do, not an easy thing to even be able to judge. Being outside of it all, it's like people have strong opinions about these topics, about when the officer should use force, when they shouldn't, and the way we look at the situations versus the way they do vary quite drastically. The average person is going to see that and wouldn't think anything up. You can kind of see the video. The officers, I think he's wearing a camera that's up here, and you see him kind of start looking down at that hand, because that hand's not come out. And that's when he started talking about pat down. And at that point in time, that's when it came out. So with that, leaving on rather somewhat of a dark note, it's like these types of situations, there are people who kill people every single day. We have a group of people who, look to help with that type of situation, to resolve it. And some officers go into the job, specifically for the opportunities to use the power that is afforded by that position. Most don't. But anytime that we've got a force on force situation, or just use of force in general, everyone has a very, very strong opinion. It's best not to hold a super strong opinion, but to always wait to see what the facts of the case were. If there's a video, watch that. The footage from the one that took place here in Oklahoma at the end of last year, was recently released about 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Like I said, I couldn't find that, but it was very, very reminiscent of the first video, where officer encounters a guy. I think it was in a kind of a walkway of an apartment complex, and during the course of the encounter, the guy pulls out a gun from his pocket and is pointing it right at the officer. Luckily, the guy didn't fire right away, and I think the officer survived that one, but the suspect ended up getting shot, and hopefully so, because that's the nature of that incident was very much he was the aggressor. He was had the intent to shoot the officer, and it's like ideally what you'd want to see that person be handled appropriately, whether that be the ultimate type of seizure where that person's life goes away, or whether it's they end up in cuffs in the back of a car and they get processed through the criminal justice system. Either way, they no longer represent a risk to society in general, or that officer in that particular situation, or anyone else they may come across. But with that concludes our discussion of use of force. If you have any questions, let me know. If you want to see any of these videos, let me know. If you have anything else you want to talk about, I'm just an email away. We'll pick up with, I think our next topic was vehicular searches, that kind of stuff. We'll hit that on Wednesday. We'll go through that one pretty quick, because it's going to align pretty closely with everything we've already been talking about. I'll hit some nuance points for that. And then we'll move into things that aren't searches, your exceptions to the search warrants, basically places that do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. With that, I will let you go. You all have a great day, and I'll be seeing you. And hopefully, by the time we get back on class on Wednesday, we won't have another class we're going to do online or Zoom or anything like that, other than those of you outside of the Tahlequah area who Zoom into class. We'll be back in the classroom in standard format from here on out the rest of the semester. I'm expecting smooth sailing, because we got all the rough stuff out of the way in the first half of the semester. least that's I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that one. With that, you all take care and have a great day. Bye.